My name is Eleanor, and I am in my late 60s. I was once the respected widow of a powerful man whose influence reached into the highest levels of government and business, a woman accustomed to a life of prominence and privilege that came with hosting elaborate dinner parties and attending exclusive social gatherings. But I was also privy to deep, unsettling family secrets that most people in our circle could never have imagined, dark truths that lurked beneath the polished surface of our seemingly perfect life. Now those very secrets have become my cage, and the knowledge I carry has transformed from a burden of loyalty into a weapon that threatens everything my family has built. I dedicated my entire adult life to supporting my husband's political career with unwavering devotion, maintaining a dignified public facade despite the hidden misdeeds I gradually discovered over our decades together. I played the perfect political wife, smiling at fundraisers while knowing the true source of our wealth, entertaining influential guests while carrying the weight of terrible secrets. I raised my son with love and care, instilling in him what I believed were strong moral values, trusting him implicitly with my deepest affections, never imagining that one day he would become not my protector, but my jailer. After my husband's sudden death from a heart attack that shocked our entire social circle, I found myself holding incriminating truths about his extensive illicit dealings, evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government truths that threatened not only my son's rapidly advancing political career, but also his access to the vast fortune built on decades of carefully hidden criminal activity. My son and his equally ambitious wife moved swiftly to contain what they saw as a dangerous liability. They isolated me from my longtime friends and political allies, issuing chilling, barely veiled threats against anyone who might listen to what I had to say. They orchestrated subtle but terrifying accidents. A trusted friend's car developing mysterious brake problems, another longtime companion suffering a convenient fall downstairs, creating an atmosphere of fear that served as deadly signals of their intent, should I ever consider speaking the truth about what I knew. Yet, unbeknownst to them, I possessed something far more dangerous than mere memories or casual knowledge. Hidden away in a place they would never think to look, I had kept a meticulously coded journal spanning years of careful documentation, a detailed chronicle of my husband's true dealings that included names, dates, bank account numbers, and transaction records that could destroy not just my family, but an entire network of powerful, corrupt individuals. It was not exactly a smoking gun that I could simply hand to authorities, but it was a comprehensive chronicle of their darkness, a terrifying truth. I knew I had to protect not just for my own survival, but for the very integrity of my soul and the safety of anyone who might help me. My grand home, which had once been filled with the constant hum of political activity and elegant social gatherings that brought together the most influential people in our state, became something resembling a silent, opulent cage, where every beautiful room felt like a cell, decorated with priceless artifacts and family portraits that now seemed to mock my captivity. The familiar faces of my longtime household staff people, who had worked for our family for decades and knew me better than my own relatives, were systematically replaced by distant, watchful figures who claimed to be temporary help, but whose eyes held the cold calculation of hired guards rather than the warmth of domestic workers who cared about my well-being. My phone calls, which had once connected me to a vast network of political wives, charity organizers, and social friends who had shared decades of confidences and mutual support, began going mysteriously unanswered. Letters I wrote to express concern about friends I hadn't heard from in weeks would vanish before reaching the mail, and invitations to events I had attended faithfully for years simply stopped arriving. Each day brought a fresh wave of chilling isolation that created a stark contrast to the bustling, purposeful life I had always known, where my calendar had been filled with meaningful activities, and my phone had rung constantly with calls from people who valued my opinions and sought my advice on everything from political strategy to charitable fundraising. This systematic severing of my connections to the outside world reinforced the terrifying new reality that I was becoming a prisoner in plain sight, someone whose freedom had been taken away so gradually and skillfully that even I sometimes wondered if I was imagining the bars of my cage. The silence that now surrounded me felt oppressive and deliberate, designed to make me question my own perceptions and memories. My son and daughter-in-law moved through this imposed solitude with an unsettling calm that spoke of careful planning and absolute confidence in their control over my circumstances. Their smiles were always perfectly calibrated, appearing genuine to any outside observer, but feeling hollow and artificial to someone who knew them intimately enough to recognize the cold calculation behind their practiced expressions. Their voices carried a constant undercurrent of steel. Beneath the surface, politeness, a quality that reminded me of how my husband had spoken to political opponents who had crossed him, respectful on the surface, but clearly dangerous underneath. When they addressed me, there was always an edge of warning in their tone, a subtle reminder that my situation could become much worse if I didn't cooperate with their version of reality. Any attempt I made to question my sudden lack of communication with longtime friends, or to insist on seeing someone from my genuine social circle rather than their carefully selected visitors, was met with polite but absolutely firm resistance that brooked no argument or negotiation. "Mother, you've been quite unwell lately since Father's passing," my daughter-in-law would say, with false concern, her voice carrying just enough medical authority to sound credible to anyone who might overhear. "The doctor specifically recommended that we limit your visitors during this difficult period of grief and recovery. Too much stimulation could set back your healing process significantly." "We're only thinking of your best interests," my son would add, with the patient tone he had perfected during his political career, the same voice he used when explaining complex policy positions to journalists who asked inconvenient questions. "Some of your old friends have been asking rather pointed questions about Father's business dealings, and we thought it would be better for everyone if you had some time to process your grief privately before having to deal with their curiosity." Their systematic obstruction ensured my total isolation from anyone who might validate my memories or provide alternative perspectives on our family's history. They were solidifying the terrifying feeling that my genuine connections to the outside world were being systematically severed. One by one, my voice silenced before I could even attempt to use it, my pleas for normalcy falling on ears that heard only what they chose to acknowledge. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of my new reality, because it forced me to question everything I thought I knew about my own life and relationships. I found myself grappling with the most fundamental and disturbing question any person can face. How could the people I had loved and trusted most completely be capable of such calculated cruelty? I replayed memories of my son as a young boy, searching desperately for signs of the ruthless stranger he had become, trying to identify the precise moment when his natural ambition had transformed into something so cold and dangerous. He had been such a loving child, always eager to please, always seeking approval for his achievements and comfort when he faced disappointments. I remembered teaching him about right and wrong, about the importance of integrity and compassion, about using whatever privileges we enjoyed to help others rather than simply accumulating more power and wealth for ourselves. Those conversations seemed like scenes from someone else's life now. So completely had he abandoned every value I thought I had instilled in him. I blame myself for not recognizing the warning signs, for not seeing how his father's influence was gradually corrupting his moral compass, for focusing so much on maintaining our family's public image that I had failed to protect his character from the toxic environment of political ambition and financial corruption that surrounded us. Then I would rage against my own helplessness, against the impossible situation they had created, where speaking the truth would endanger not just myself, but anyone who tried to help me. The frustration of knowing terrible secrets, but being unable to act on them without causing potentially deadly consequences, was a form of torture I had never imagined possible. Finally, I would sink into a fog of confusion and despair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was facing and the limited options available to someone in my position. There seemed to be no logic to their cruelty beyond pure self-interest, no way to appeal to whatever remained of their humanity, because they had apparently decided that their political and financial ambitions were more important than family bonds or basic human decency. Their words became a constant, insidious hum in the background of my existence, carefully designed to erode whatever remained of my confidence and independence. Mother, some things are truly better left buried, especially painful memories from Father's final years. My son would state with calm authority, whenever I made even the slightest reference to my husband's questionable business practices. Your loyalty should be to the living members of this family, not to dead memories that could hurt all of us. His wife would add with a smile so sweet it made my skin crawl. Dwelling on the past isn't healthy for someone in your emotional state. You need to focus on moving forward and letting us take care of the complicated details. The most chilling moment came one evening when my son leaned close to my chair and whispered with terrifying casualness, "You know, Mother, I've noticed that people who spend too much time digging up old graves sometimes have unfortunate accidents themselves. It would be such a tragedy if something happened to you just when we're all trying to heal as a family." Their subtle remarks were designed to make me question whether my memories were accurate, whether my concerns about their behavior were valid, whether I was perhaps becoming paranoid and unstable in my grief. The psychological torment was relentless and sophisticated, forcing me to doubt my own perceptions and drowning me in self-doubt until I truly feared for my sanity. But caught in their web of false protection, I began to wonder if they were right, if I was losing my grip on reality, if the stress of my husband's death had somehow damaged my ability to think clearly about our family situation. The constant gaslighting was so skillful that even someone with my experience in political manipulation found herself questioning what she knew to be true. Yet deep within the suffocating atmosphere of terror and control they had created around me, a stubborn flicker of intelligence and determination remained alive like an ember that refused to be completely extinguished. The coded journal I had kept hidden for so many years became my secret anchor, my silent act of defiance against their attempts to rewrite our family's history. In my brief moments of genuine solitude, when their surveillance relaxed just enough to allow me some privacy, I would mentally revisit the pages of that journal, reaffirming the truths it contained with the same devotion others might bring to prayer or meditation. Every entry was burned into my memory with perfect clarity. the precise dates of illicit transactions, the code names for offshore bank accounts, the real names behind shell corporations, the detailed records of meetings with criminal associates. The journal contained information about key players in my late husband's extensive network of corruption people, whose names would be instantly recognizable to anyone who followed politics or business news, individuals whose reputations and freedom would be destroyed if the truth about their activities ever became public knowledge. It was a terrifying burden to carry such dangerous information, but it also represented a form of silent power that they couldn't take away from me, no matter how completely they controlled my external circumstances. I couldn't act on that information safely, not yet, and perhaps not ever, but it provided an internal validation that I desperately needed. The journal served as proof that I was still sane and still aware that my memories were accurate, and my understanding of our family's criminal activities was based on careful documentation rather than paranoid fantasies. Most importantly, it confirmed that the truth still existed somewhere in the world, preserved in my hidden chronicle, a vital spark of authenticity that could survive even their most oppressive attempts to silence me completely. One evening, while my son and daughter-in-law were attending what they claimed was an important political fundraiser, but which I suspected was actually a meeting with some of their more questionable associates, I found myself with a rare opportunity for genuine solitude in the house that had become my beautiful prison. They had grown increasingly confident in their control over my circumstances and perhaps slightly careless about securing every potential source of information that might complicate their carefully constructed narrative about our family's activities. For the first time in weeks, I was able to move through the house without feeling the constant presence of their hired watchers or the oppressive awareness that every word and action was being monitored and evaluated. I hadn't initially planned to conduct any kind of investigation, but something drew me to my late husband's private study, a room they usually kept locked, but which someone had carelessly left accessible during their absence. As I stood in that familiar space, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a life I had shared for so many decades, I felt compelled to look for something, though I wasn't entirely sure what I hoped to find. My hand brushed almost accidentally against what felt like a loose wooden panel behind one of the built-in bookshelves, and when I pressed against it, a small hidden compartment opened to reveal items I had never seen before, despite all the years I had spent in that room. Inside was a small, worn, leather-bound address book that clearly didn't belong to my husband, based on the handwriting and the unfamiliar organization system. After examining it more closely, I realized it had belonged to my husband's brother, a man who had died many years earlier and who had been estranged from our family for reasons that were never fully explained to me. The brothers had fallen out over some business disagreement that my husband had always described in vague terms, claiming it was too complicated and painful to discuss in detail. The address book contained what appeared to be a simple list of names and phone numbers, the kind of mundane information that any person might keep for staying in touch with friends and business contacts. But as I studied the entries more carefully, many of the names became disturbingly familiar, matching people I had identified in my own coded journal as key associates in my husband's illicit financial network. These weren't random coincidences or innocent overlaps in social circles. These were the same individuals who had appeared repeatedly in my husband's most questionable dealings, people whose involvement in our family's activities I had documented meticulously over the years without ever fully understanding the scope of their criminal enterprise. This small detail might have been easily overlooked by someone who wasn't already aware of the broader pattern of corruption, but to me, it sent a prickle of cold awareness through my entire body. The discovery solidified a horrifying suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind, that the criminal network my husband had built was far more extensive and organized than I had ever imagined. This address book, combined with a fragmented memory that had been nagging at me for days, began to suggest implications that were far more sinister than anything I had previously considered. I remembered a hushed but heated argument between my husband and his brother that had taken place years ago, shortly before the brother's death, an argument I had overheard partially, but had never fully understood. The brother had been talking about loose ends that needed to be tied up properly, and warning my husband about people who knew too much for their own good. At the time, I had assumed they were discussing some ordinary business dispute, but now, those fragments of conversation took on a much darker meaning in light of what I had learned about our family's true activities. The discovery wasn't just about my husband's illicit dealings, which I had already documented extensively in my hidden journal. This suggested something far more disturbing: the existence of a deeper, wider conspiracy involving a network of powerful individuals, some of whom were still very much alive, and apparently now connected to my son's political career. The accidents that had been befalling my friends and former allies suddenly felt less like random threats designed to intimidate me, and more like professional measures carried out by people with extensive experience in eliminating problems that threatened their interests. The implications revealed the true scale of the power my son and his wife now wielded, and their apparent willingness to use that power in ways that went far beyond simple political corruption. As these disturbing realizations began to crystallize in my mind, I found myself remembering other details from our family's past that I had previously dismissed as unrelated coincidences. I recalled a period several years ago when my son had suddenly and inexplicably acquired significant wealth, claiming it came from smart investments and fortunate business opportunities that he preferred not to discuss in detail. At the time, I had been proud of his apparent financial acumen and hadn't pressed for specifics about his investment strategies, trusting that he had simply inherited his father's talent for identifying profitable opportunities. Now, however, that memory resurfaced with chilling clarity, aligning perfectly with information from my coded journal. I remembered documenting a substantial transfer of funds from one of my husband's shell corporations directly into an offshore account during the exact same month that my son's investments had supposedly paid off so spectacularly. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, and the amounts involved were too large to represent anything other than a deliberate inheritance of ill-gotten wealth. This wasn't a case of my son gradually discovering his father's criminal activities after inheriting the family business. This was evidence of deep, long-standing complicity in the family's darker enterprises, proof that he had been actively participating in and benefiting from criminal activities for much longer than I had realized. The realization that my son's corruption wasn't a recent development brought on by political ambition, but rather a pattern of calculated participation in inherited criminality, was perhaps the most devastating blow of all. Everything I thought I knew about his character and his moral development had been based on a carefully maintained illusion. Several days after my disturbing discovery in the study during one of their forced social visits designed to maintain the appearance of normal family interaction, I decided to test the boundaries of their knowledge and control with what I hoped would appear to be innocent conversation. I was just reminiscing about your uncle the other day. I said to my son with carefully practiced casualness while we sat in the living room, pretending to enjoy afternoon tea together. He was such a private man, wasn't he? I remember he had such particular, meticulous handwriting in that address book of his. So many interesting contacts from all those different industries. The transformation in my son's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. His usual composure, the carefully controlled political persona he had perfected over years of public life, shattered completely for just a moment. His expensive china teacup clattered against its saucer as his hand trembled with what appeared to be genuine shock, and his eyes, normally so calculating and controlled, flashed with raw, uncharacteristic fear. Mother, why on earth are you bringing him up after all these years? He snapped, his voice sharp and defensive in a way that bore no resemblance to his usual measured tones. He's been gone for decades. There's no point in dwelling on old family conflicts that can't be resolved. He caught himself quickly and attempted to recover with what was meant to be a dismissive laugh, but the sound came out strained and artificial. You always remember the oddest details about people, don't you? I'm sure his address book was perfectly ordinary, just like everyone else's. You shouldn't let your imagination run away with you about such mundane things. But I had seen the truth in that unguarded moment of panic, the fear that flickered across his features when he realized I might have access to information that could complicate their carefully constructed version of our family's history. His uncharacteristic agitation and his quick, obviously defensive response confirmed everything my growing suspicion had been telling me about the scope of their criminal enterprise. The incident made it clear that I was getting dangerously close to understanding something they desperately needed to keep hidden, and their awareness of my investigation was intensifying both my terror and my determination to uncover the complete truth about what had become of my family. The pieces of this horrible puzzle were still frustratingly disjointed and incomplete, scattered across decades of carefully hidden activities and protected by layers of secrecy that would take much more than casual investigation to penetrate fully. But the weight of this partial knowledge felt absolutely crushing, pressing down on me like a physical force that made it difficult to breathe or think clearly about my next steps. My growing understanding confirmed the most chilling suspicion I had been afraid to fully acknowledge. My son and his wife weren't simply protecting their political future from embarrassing revelations about my husband's past mistakes. They were actively continuing and expanding a legacy of sophisticated corruption, maintaining and operating the criminal network they had inherited, while using my son's political position to provide protection and legitimacy for their activities. This wasn't the closure or relief that comes from solving a mystery. It was the disturbing confirmation of generational malevolence that went far beyond anything I had imagined possible from people who shared my blood and claimed to love me. Yet I still lacked the kind of coherent, actionable proof that would allow me to expose them safely, and I had no means to take meaningful action without putting myself and others in mortal danger. The unease that had been growing inside me intensified into a constant anxiety that colored every interaction with dread and suspicion. Rather than feeling empowered by my discoveries, I felt more frightened and heartbroken than ever before, knowing the true depth of the depravity I was facing while remaining essentially helpless to do anything about it without signing my own death warrant. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to understand the complete scope of this inherited corruption that seemed to reach into every aspect of our family's life and my son's political career, I began conducting what could only be described as a covert internal investigation that became my secret obsession and the only thing that gave my increasingly restricted days any sense of purpose beyond mere survival. During my brief moments of genuine solitude, when their surveillance relaxed just enough to allow me some mental privacy, I would carefully cross-reference dates and names from my hidden journal with public information about my son's political activities that I could access through newspapers and television coverage of his career. The coincidences I discovered were both fascinating and terrifying in their precision. Major policy positions he had taken supposedly based on his principled political philosophy aligned perfectly with the financial interests of individuals I knew from my documentation to be key players in my husband's criminal network. Committee assignments he had requested and received matched exactly with the regulatory oversight needs of businesses controlled by his inherited criminal associates. I strained to overhear fragments of their hushed conversations with visitors they described as political advisors and campaign consultants, but whose discussions seemed to focus more on financial arrangements and potential security issues than on traditional political strategy. These conversations took place in rooms I wasn't allowed to enter, but sound carried through the house in ways they didn't seem to fully appreciate. The terminology they used wasn't the language of normal political discourse. They spoke about managing exposure, containing situations, and permanent solutions to persistent problems, with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested these weren't hypothetical scenarios, but established procedures for dealing with threats to their interests. My mind, though constantly weary from the stress of living under their control, became sharper and more focused in this one crucial area, transformed by desperation into an instrument capable of detecting patterns and connections that my previous trusting nature would never have noticed. Every small piece of information felt like a victory proof that some essential part of me remained capable of independent thought and analysis, despite their best efforts to reduce me to a compliant observer. Through weeks of careful analysis of their careless remarks, comments they made when they thought I was too distracted or medicated to understand the implications, a clearer and infinitely more disturbing picture began to emerge of their true motivations and methods. Their ambition wasn't simply for political power or even legitimate wealth goals that would have been understandable if morally questionable. What they sought was absolute unchecked control over a criminal enterprise that generated untraceable wealth while providing them with the political influence necessary to protect their operations from law enforcement or regulatory interference. My husband's sudden death had created a dangerous vacuum in the leadership of this network, and my son and his wife weren't just inheriting his legacy, they were actively expanding it, leveraging his political position to provide legitimacy and protection for activities that went far beyond anything my husband had ever attempted. The systematic isolation they had imposed on me, the chilling threats against my friends, the carefully orchestrated accidents that had befallen anyone who asked inconvenient questions. All of these tactics were part of a comprehensive strategy to eliminate any threat to their escalating criminal empire. They needed to ensure that I remained not just silent, but completely compliant, a witness who could be trusted never to speak about what she had seen and learned over the decades of our family's involvement in activities that could destroy not just their careers, but their freedom, and possibly their lives. As my subtle observations and growing awareness began to penetrate their assumptions about my passivity and ignorance, their tactics evolved in ways that became noticeably more desperate and overtly threatening. They seemed to sense that something had changed in my level of compliance, that I was somehow becoming more resistant to their control, despite their careful management of my circumstances. My telephone, which had already been moved beyond my easy reach under the pretense of protecting me from upsetting calls, from people who might ask difficult questions about our family's situation, was now removed entirely from my room and relocated to an area where any conversation I might have could be easily monitored. The change was explained as a temporary measure for my own protection, but the message was unmistakably clear. My access to the outside world was being systematically eliminated to prevent any possibility of my communicating with people who might take my concerns seriously or investigate our family's activities. One night, in what represented perhaps the most chilling escalation of their intimidation tactics, my beloved Siamese cat mysteriously vanished from the house where she had lived safely for years. I spent hours searching frantically, calling her name and checking every room and closet, terrified that she might have somehow escaped outside or been hurt in some accident. Hours later, after I had worked myself into a state of near panic, one of their hired staff members discovered her locked in a remote storage shed on the far edge of our property, shivering from cold and clearly traumatized by her experience. The staff member claimed it was simply an unfortunate accident, suggesting that the cat had somehow wandered into the shed and accidentally triggered the latch that trapped her inside. But I knew better. The shed was kept locked at all times, and my cat was far too cautious and intelligent to have ventured into such an obviously dangerous space on her own. This was a carefully planned demonstration of their power over everything and everyone I cared about, a subtle but unmistakable message about what could happen to anyone or anything that mattered to me if I continued to resist their control. The incident served multiple purposes. It showed me how easily they could reach anyone or anything in my life. It demonstrated their willingness to cause suffering to innocent creatures to make their point, and it reminded me that my isolation was so complete that even obvious threats against my pet would be dismissed as unfortunate accidents by anyone who might question them. They began systematically poisoning my reputation among any former colleagues, political allies, or social friends who dared to inquire about my well-being or express concern about my sudden withdrawal from public life. Phone calls from old friends were intercepted and returned with carefully crafted explanations about my rapid deterioration following my husband's death and my increasing tendency toward paranoid delusions that made social contact potentially harmful to my fragile mental state. These character assassination campaigns served a dual purpose. They isolated me further by discouraging people from trying to maintain contact while simultaneously creating a narrative that would discredit anything I might say if I ever found an opportunity to speak out about what I had discovered about our family's criminal activities. The portrait they painted was of a grieving widow whose mind had been damaged by loss and stress, someone whose claims about criminal conspiracies and death threats would be dismissed as the confused fantasies of a woman who was no longer capable of distinguishing reality from paranoid imagination. Their casual jokes about how easily accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business intensified until they became a constant drumbeat of psychological terrorism designed to reinforce my sense of vulnerability and dependence on their protection. Every conversation included subtle reminders of my isolation and helplessness, carefully phrased warnings about the dangers that awaited anyone foolish enough to interfere in matters they didn't understand. "It's such a dangerous world out there, Mother," my daughter-in-law would say, with false concern, while reading newspaper accounts of traffic accidents or sudden illnesses that had befallen prominent citizens. You're so fortunate to have family who can protect you from all these unpredictable tragedies that seem to strike people when they least expect it. The relentless combination of psychological manipulation and increasingly overt threats began taking a devastating toll on every aspect of my physical and emotional well-being. Sleep became almost impossible, offering no respite from the daily assault on my sense of security and sanity, only fractured dreams filled with images of silent threats and hidden dangers that pursued me even into unconsciousness. My body began to reflect the stress of living under constant threat, developing a persistent ache that seemed to emanate from my very bones and made every movement feel labored and difficult. My appetite disappeared entirely as the anxiety of never knowing what new threat might emerge made the simple act of eating feel impossible. My hands developed a tremor that wasn't related to age, but rather to the constant internal terror of never knowing when their patience with my continued existence might finally run out. The physical manifestations of fear became harder to hide, providing them with additional evidence they could use to support their narrative of my declining mental and physical health. I felt utterly trapped in a web of criminal conspiracy and family betrayal so complete that every attempt to understand or resist it only seemed to tighten the bonds that held me captive. The weight of their combined depravity was slowly crushing whatever remained of my spirit, grinding down the strong, dignified woman I had always been until I feared there would be nothing left but a terrified witness to crimes I could never safely report. This was no longer simply a fight for truth or justice. It had become a desperate battle for my very survival against people who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their interests, including the mother who had devoted her life to protecting and nurturing them before they became the monsters that now held her prisoner in her own home. The moment of devastating clarity arrived like a lightning bolt, cutting through the fog of denial and hope I had been desperately clinging to, illuminating a truth so horrifying that it made my blood turn to ice and confirmed every terrible suspicion I had been trying to convince myself might be wrong. It happened on what had started as an ordinary afternoon when my son's most trusted associate, a man I had noticed appearing frequently at our home over the past several months, brought me my afternoon tea with the same cold professionalism he brought to all his interactions. He was a person whose eyes reminded me of polished glass reflecting light, but revealing nothing of what lay beneath the surface, someone who moved through our house with the quiet efficiency of a predator comfortable in familiar territory. As he set the delicate china teacup down on the table beside my chair, with practiced precision, a small but unmistakably distinctive object slipped from his jacket pocket and clattered softly against the hardwood floor. It was a family signet ring that I recognized immediately, despite not having seen it for many years. An antique piece that had belonged to my late husband's brother, the same man whose hidden address book I had discovered in the study just weeks earlier. The ring was an heirloom that had been in our family for generations, passed down through the male line as a symbol of tradition and continuity. It had disappeared after my brother-in-law's death, and I had assumed it had been buried with him, or perhaps lost in the settling of his estate. Seeing it now in the possession of this cold-eyed stranger who worked for my son sent a shock of recognition and terror through my entire body. The man retrieved the ring quickly, his face remaining completely impassive, as if nothing significant had happened, but I had seen enough to understand the implications. This wasn't just a coincidence or an innocent inheritance. This was a direct link, a terrifying confirmation of connections that went far deeper than I had imagined possible. This man wasn't simply an associate or political advisor, as they had described him to me. He was something far more sinister, an enforcer, a direct connection to the illicit network that my husband had built and that my son had now inherited and expanded. The ring served as proof of his credentials within their criminal organization, a symbol of authority that linked him directly to the violent enforcement mechanisms that kept their enterprise functioning smoothly. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My son wasn't just continuing his father's political corruption or financial crimes. He had inherited and was actively operating the entire infrastructure of intimidation, violence, and elimination that such an enterprise required to maintain itself. The accidents that had befallen my friends weren't random acts of intimidation. They were professional operations carried out by people like this man, people who wore family heirlooms as badges of their deadly authority. The truth, now fully revealed in all its ugly completeness, was more devastating than anything I could have imagined, even in my darkest moments of fear and suspicion. My son and his wife weren't simply protecting a legacy of political corruption or trying to hide embarrassing financial irregularities that might damage their careers. They were actively perpetuating and expanding a comprehensive criminal enterprise, leveraging an extensive network of power, wealth, and silent intimidation that they had inherited from my husband and were now using for their own ruthless political and financial advancement. They had demonstrated their willingness to threaten my oldest friends, to orchestrate accidents that served as warnings to anyone who might ask inconvenient questions, and to trap me in my own home like a prisoner while maintaining the fiction that they were devoted family members caring for an aging, fragile relative who needed their protection and guidance. This was a betrayal so profound and complete that it severed every last thread of trust, every cherished memory of family love, every assumption I had ever made about the bonds between parent and child. There was no room for misunderstanding here, no possibility of charitable interpretation or hope for eventual reconciliation. This was pure calculated evil, a chilling systematic act of avarice and depravity designed to silence me permanently as a witness to their crimes while maintaining their public image as respectable, successful people who had earned their position through merit and hard work rather than through inherited criminality and ongoing violence. Later that same day, when my son made one of his regular visits to check on my compliance and assess my mental state, approaching me with his usual composed demeanor and speaking in soothing tones about the importance of family unity and moving forward together, I made a decision that terrified me even as I acted on it. I looked directly into his eyes with a gaze as clear and steady as I could manage, summoning every ounce of courage I had left to confront him with what I had discovered. "You've inherited more than just your father's political ambition, haven't you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, but laced with a profound, terrifying clarity that cut through all their careful pretenses. "You've inherited his darkness, his willingness to destroy anyone who threatens what you've built. You've become everything I hoped you would never be." The transformation in his expression was immediate and unmistakable. His practiced political smile faltered completely, replaced by a flicker of something raw and primitive, a combination of fear, fury, and recognition that his carefully maintained facade had been penetrated by someone he had believed was too frightened and isolated to pose any real threat to his operation. "Mother, you're not well?" He replied, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining his performance, even as his eyes blazed with barely contained malevolence. "You're imagining connections that don't exist, seeing conspiracies where there are only normal business relationships. The stress of Father's death has obviously affected your ability to think clearly about these matters." His wife, who had been approaching the room to check on our conversation, stopped in the doorway and subtly tensed when she heard my accusation. Her body language spoke volumes about her awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic they had worked so hard to control, that their victim was displaying a level of understanding that could threaten their entire carefully constructed narrative. Their immediate denial, their refusal to acknowledge the truth, even when confronted directly with evidence of their crimes, served as silent but devastating confirmation of everything I had suspected and feared. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with honest conversation. This was a deliberate, ongoing criminal conspiracy that would continue regardless of what I knew or said about their true nature. The confrontation felt less like an exchange of words than a battle between souls, a moment when all pretense fell away, and we faced each other as what we really were: victim and victimizers, the destroyed and the destroyers, love corrupted into the most calculating form of exploitation imaginable. It left me simultaneously shattered by the confirmation of my worst fears and strangely relieved to finally know beyond any doubt that my instincts about their true character had been accurate. There would be no reconciliation, no appeal to whatever remained of their humanity, no hope that they might eventually choose family bonds over criminal enterprise. Their reaction to my moment of clarity solidified my understanding that they were beyond any possibility of redemption explanation or appeal to basic human decency. The malice I had sensed beneath their performance wasn't the product of desperation or unfortunate circumstances. It was a fundamental part of their character, a coldness so complete that it remained constant even when directly confronted with the suffering they were causing. The malice remained exactly as it had always been, carefully cloaked in sweet words and false concern when others might be present, but revealing itself as raw venom whenever they felt safe to drop their masks in my presence. The threats not only continued, but seemed to intensify after my brief moment of clarity, becoming more oppressive than ever, as if they were punishing me for my awareness and determination to prevent any future lapses in their control. They began monitoring my responses and reactions more carefully than ever before, watching for any signs that I might be developing additional resistance to their psychological manipulation or regaining enough confidence to pose a sustained threat to their operation. The performance of devoted caregivers seemed to receive new direction, their shows of concern becoming more elaborate and frequent, as if they were trying to overwhelm any remaining connection I might have to my authentic understanding of our situation. I realized with crushing finality that true emotional closure, genuine acknowledgement of their crimes, or any form of justice from the people who had destroyed my family was an impossible dream that would never be fulfilled. They had committed what they believed was the perfect crime, one that used my own love and loyalty against me while making me appear to be the unreliable victim of my own declining mental health rather than their deliberate abuse. My heart ached with a chilling sense of permanent estrangement that went far beyond my separation from my former life and social connections. I was estranged from the very concept of family itself, from the basic human bonds that should have protected and nurtured me in my time of vulnerability, but had instead been corrupted into weapons used for my systematic destruction. My only remaining path was to endure this reality with whatever dignity I could preserve to survive as a prisoner in my own home while they continued to benefit from their inherited criminality. I was living under the chilling weight of understanding the true price of power, watching helplessly as evil prospered while good suffered in silence. I now carried the full crushing weight of this terrifying truth like a physical burden that made every breath feel labored and every moment of consciousness a struggle against despair. I was living under the direct and immediate threat of my own son and daughter-in-law, existing as a witness to a vast, sophisticated criminal network that they controlled with ruthless efficiency, with my secret coded journal serving as the only complete chronicle of their inherited darkness and ongoing crimes. This truth was too monstrous and unbelievable to share with anyone, too dangerous to voice without signing my own death warrant and potentially the death warrants of anyone who might try to help me. Who would believe such an elaborate conspiracy coming from an elderly woman who had already been systematically discredited, stripped of all credibility and social connections by the very people she was accusing of the most heinous crimes imaginable? My son had carefully cultivated a public image as a rising political star, someone whose integrity and dedication to public service were beyond question. My daughter-in-law was equally respected in their social circles, known for her charitable work and her devotion to caring for her aging mother-in-law. Any attempt to expose their true nature would be met with sympathetic head shaking and gentle suggestions that I clearly needed better medical care for my obviously deteriorating mental condition. They had built their deception so carefully, created such a comprehensive narrative of my supposed instability following my husband's death, that my own testimony against them would only serve as further evidence of how desperately I needed their protective intervention. Worse than simply being dismissed, speaking out would certainly lead to my immediate elimination and would likely endanger the few remaining people I cared about. The secret of what they were doing burned like a coal of rage and terror in my heart, heavy and isolating, creating a constant reminder of my complete powerlessness in the face of evil that wore familiar faces and spoke in loving tones. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but sharing it would only accelerate the timeline of my destruction while achieving nothing positive for anyone. Standing alone in the bedroom that had once been my private sanctuary, but now felt like a cell in an elaborate prison designed to look like a loving family home, I found myself facing the most desolate crossroads a human being can encounter. The choice before me would determine not just how I spent whatever time remained to me, but whether I would survive long enough to see any kind of resolution to this nightmare. To fight for external justice, to somehow find a way to leak information from my journal or expose their crimes to law enforcement agencies or journalists who might investigate our family's activities, would require a level of access to the outside world that they had systematically eliminated. More importantly, it would mean risking total retaliation, not just against myself, but against anyone who had ever shown me kindness or loyalty. I thought about my few remaining friends who still inquired about my well-being, the household staff members who treated me with genuine respect and compassion, even casual acquaintances who might become collateral damage in any war between my family and the forces of justice. The people I cared about would become targets for elimination, their lives forfeit, because they had been unfortunate enough to earn my affection or trust. It would mean attempting to wage a public battle I was far too frail and isolated to win fighting against enemies who controlled vast resources and had demonstrated their willingness to use lethal force to protect their interests. They had political connections, financial resources, and access to professional criminals who could make problems disappear with frightening efficiency. The alternative path stretched before me like a descent into a different kind of hell, choosing a strategy of silent survival, accepting my role as a powerless witness while focusing all my energy on internal resistance and the preservation of whatever dignity and sanity I could maintain under impossible circumstances. This wasn't surrender, though I knew that's how any observer would interpret it. It was a form of strategic wisdom, a recognition that some battles cannot be won through direct confrontation when the enemy holds all the advantages and the victim has been systematically stripped of every resource that might level the playing field. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it might be one of my last, as the independent woman I had always believed myself to be, I made the decision that would define whatever remained of my existence. It was born not of surrender to their evil, though I knew they would see it that way, but of grim necessity and overwhelming fear for the safety of anyone who might try to help me. I would not pursue external justice or attempt to expose their crimes to a world that had already been convinced of my unreliability and their devotion. My survival and the fragile hope of keeping my remaining friends and allies safe from retaliation demanded a different kind of strategy, a retreat into internal resilience that might allow me to preserve whatever fragments of my authentic self could survive in the hostile environment they had created around me. It was a painful acknowledgement of complete powerlessness, a recognition that some battles, however righteous and necessary they might be, cannot be won by confronting such deeply entrenched evil directly when one has been left so utterly vulnerable and defenseless. My focus would shift from fighting them to simply surviving them, from trying to expose their crimes to protecting the evidence I had gathered while maintaining the silence they demanded. This decision brought with it a terrible kind of peace, the relief that comes from finally accepting a reality too dangerous to continue fighting against. I would endure rather than resist, preserve, rather than reveal, survive, rather than seek justice. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the only one that offered any possibility of maintaining my life and protecting others from becoming victims of their retaliation. My son's political career continued to flourish with each passing month, his public image becoming more polished and inspiring as his influence grew throughout the state and beyond. He delivered speeches about integrity and public service with the kind of passionate conviction that convinced voters he truly believed in the principles he claimed to represent, while behind the scenes, he operated the criminal network he had inherited with ruthless efficiency. He and his wife hosted increasingly lavish parties and charity events, their smiles growing wider and more confident as their social status rose their facade of respectability, becoming seemingly impenetrable to anyone who didn't know the truth about how their success was actually funded. Every elegant gathering was paid for with ill-gotten wealth that represented decades of my husband's dark legacy money that should have been used to repair the damage their crimes had caused rather than to further their own ambitions. They continued to present a flawless performance of devoted family members who were making tremendous sacrifices to care for an aging relative whose condition was sadly but steadily declining despite their heroic efforts. They subtly reinforced my supposed frailty and mental instability to any visitor who entered our home speaking about me in my presence, as if I were a piece of furniture whose feelings and dignity were irrelevant to the adult conversations taking place around me. This painful dichotomy between their brazen success and my internal agony created a daily reminder of how indifferent the world could be to hidden corruption, how easily society celebrated those who achieved power and wealth while remaining blind to the methods used to obtain them. Their prosperity was built on a foundation of inherited criminality and ongoing violence, but all anyone saw was the surface glamour of political success and social prominence. That evening, after making my terrible decision to abandon any hope of external justice, I allowed myself one small act of quiet defiance that they could never detect or prevent. In the privacy of my room, I carefully retrieved my coded journal from its hiding place, handling it with the reverence others might reserve for sacred texts or precious family heirlooms. I didn't write any new entries or attempt to update my documentation of their crimes. Instead, I simply held the worn leather cover in my hands, feeling its weight and texture as tangible connections to the truth they were so determined to suppress. The journal represented years of careful observation and meticulous record-keeping evidence that could destroy not just my family, but an entire network of powerful, corrupt individuals if it ever reached the right hands. Then I practiced a series of deep breathing exercises that I had learned years earlier during a particularly stressful period in my husband's political career techniques, designed to calm racing hearts and quiet anxious minds. The familiar routine helped center me in the present moment, while reminding me that I still possessed some degree of control over my internal state, even when everything external had been taken from me. It was a small, quiet act of self-care and acceptance, a personal vow to preserve my sanity and intellectual clarity, no matter what additional pressures they might bring to bear on my circumstances. The breathing exercises became my anchor in the storm of fear and helplessness that surrounded me, a way of maintaining my connection to the strong, dignified woman I had been before they began their systematic destruction of my independence. This fragile step toward accepting my brutal new reality represented my choice for silent survival over futile resistance, my decision to embrace internal rebellion while maintaining external compliance. It was a bargain with circumstances. I couldn't change a strategy for enduring the unendurable while preserving whatever remained possible of my authentic self. My days gradually evolved into a delicate internal dance, a careful navigation through the treacherous landscape of their controlled reality that required all my remaining mental strength and emotional resilience to survive with any fragment of my authentic self intact. I had learned to exist in two separate worlds simultaneously: the external world they had constructed around me, and the internal sanctuary where my true thoughts and memories could still flourish beyond their reach. I discovered unexpected solace in quiet, intensely private moments that existed in the spaces between their surveillance and control, tiny refuges of peace that they couldn't monitor or manipulate because they occurred entirely within the hidden realm of my own consciousness. Most precious of all were the times when I could focus completely on the intricate patterns of sunlight as it moved across my room throughout the day, finding meditative peace in the simple, undeniable existence of natural phenomena they could never corrupt or claim. These shifting patterns of light and shadow became symbols of truth and beauty that persisted independent of human manipulation, following laws of physics and astronomy that remained constant regardless of the lies and deceptions that surrounded me. Watching the gradual progression of sunshine across my walls became a form of prayer, a way of connecting with something pure and authentic in a world that had been systematically stripped of genuine meaning. I spent hours silently reciting poetry I had memorized during my youth, verses that had been stored in my memory for decades, like treasures waiting to be rediscovered in times of need. The familiar rhythms and beautiful language provided comfort and intellectual stimulation that they couldn't control or take away fragments of human creativity and wisdom that served as proof that beauty and truth could survive even the most hostile environments. These internal recitations became clandestine acts of mental preservation, ways of exercising my mind and maintaining my connection to the educated, cultured woman I had always been. Each poem was a small victory against their attempts to reduce me to a confused, helpless shell of my former self-evidence that my intellectual faculties remained sharp and capable despite their best efforts to convince the world otherwise. These weren't grand gestures of escape or dramatic acts of resistance that might attract their attention and bring down new forms of punishment on my head. They were tiny, desperate measures to preserve my inner world, creating hidden sanctuaries against their lies that existed in the private spaces of my consciousness, where their manufactured reality couldn't quite penetrate completely. The simple act of maintaining these internal sanctuaries became a quiet rebellion for my dignity, a way of asserting that some essential part of me remained untouchable, regardless of how completely they controlled my external circumstances. Each moment of genuine beauty or truth I could access internally was proof that they had failed to destroy everything that made me who I was. Human connection had become almost impossibly rare in my isolated existence, but when it did occur, it felt more precious than the most valuable political currency, more vital than any of the social influence I had once taken for granted. The kind, elderly housekeeper named Maria, who sometimes brought my meals, possessed an intuitive understanding that went far beyond her professional duties, an ability to see past my supposed mental fragility to something essential that remained unchanged beneath their careful manipulation. Maria never pressed me for explanations or tried to correct what others might have interpreted as confused behavior resulting from my supposed decline. Instead, she would offer fleeting, empathetic glances that carried silent acknowledgement of struggles she couldn't openly address, moments of genuine human recognition that reminded me I was still worthy of compassion and respect. Sometimes she would hum gentle, familiar tunes while she worked, filling my home with melodies that reminded me of happier times when music was a natural part of daily life, rather than something carefully controlled to maintain my compliance. Her presence brought warmth and authenticity into an environment that had been systematically drained of both, even if only for the brief duration of her visits. Even the gardener who maintained the grounds outside my window took on profound significance in my starved emotional landscape. When he trimmed the rose bushes that grew beneath my bedroom window, he would occasionally hum old songs I recognized from my youth, creating brief but genuine moments of shared humanity that transcended the barriers of class and circumstance that normally separated us. These people weren't confidants in any traditional sense. I could never risk sharing the truth of my situation with them, knowing it would only result in their immediate dismissal and possible retaliation from my captors. But they provided external validation that I was still seen and acknowledged as a human being worthy of basic courtesy and kindness, offering fragile connections to the world of genuine human interaction that existed beyond the carefully controlled boundaries of my psychological prison. The hunger for authentic human contact had become so intense that even these minimal interactions felt like glimpses of salvation to someone drowning in isolation. The simple scent of fresh-cut grass drifting through my window could feel like a warm, supportive touch from the outside world, a reminder that life continued to exist and flourish in ways they could never completely control or corrupt. I began engaging in what became my most important form of internal rebellion and intellectual preservation. Using only my mind as both instrument and repository, I started writing new entries in my mental journal, not with a pen on paper, but through vivid, detailed recollections of recent events that I committed to memory with the same precision I had once used for actual documentation. I carefully recorded the subtle threats in my son's voice when he spoke about the importance of family loyalty, the cold calculation that flickered in his wife's eyes when she thought no one was observing her true reactions, the way their hired associates moved through our house with the silent menace of predators comfortable in familiar territory. This internal chronicling became a meticulous act of bearing witness, a desperate attempt to keep the truth alive in my consciousness, even if I could never safely commit it to paper or share it with anyone else. Every detail I preserved in memory was proof that my observational skills remained sharp, and my understanding of their true nature was based on careful analysis rather than paranoid imagination. This mental documentation became my quiet act of rebellion, my way of ensuring that their true nature was not forgotten or dismissed, even if the evidence existed only within my own thoughts. It served as my anchor during the worst moments of psychological manipulation, reminding me that I retained the ability to think clearly and observe accurately despite their best efforts to convince me otherwise. The internal passion for truth and accuracy became my secret triumph, my silent defiance against their systematic attempts to rewrite reality according to their preferences. It was a testament to my enduring intellect and moral fortitude, proof that some essential part of me remained uncorrupted by their influence and capable of independent thought and judgment. Yet even these small victories against complete intellectual erasure were shadowed by the constant oppressive presence of their deception and control. Their forced smiles and unsettling cheerfulness created a perpetual atmosphere of menace that made every moment feel dangerous and uncertain, a reminder that their performance of devotion was exactly that, a carefully maintained act designed to hide their true intentions. Their subtle gaslighting continued relentlessly deployed with surgical precision whenever they sensed any sign of resistance or independent thinking on my part. Every conversation was carefully designed to erode my confidence in my own perceptions, every interaction crafted to remind me that without their protection, I would be lost and helpless in a world too complex and dangerous for my supposedly damaged mind to navigate safely. Their constant presence served as a perpetual reminder of my vulnerability and dependence, ensuring that the deep, aching wound of my lost freedom and violated trust never had a chance to heal or even begin to close. The question of whether they would ever truly stop their manipulation and control became a constant thrum in the background of my consciousness, a painful reminder that my captivity might continue indefinitely. Their public success, built on a foundation of hidden corruption and inherited criminality, was a daily torment that highlighted the world's blindness to the chilling reality of how power actually functioned in our society. Watching them prosper while I suffered in silence was a constant reminder of the price that good people paid for the prosperity of those willing to embrace evil without conscience or limitation. The triggering moment arrived without warning during what had seemed like an ordinary afternoon of enforced isolation, shattering the fragile emotional equilibrium I had been carefully constructing within the confines of my internal world. The sound that destroyed my peace came from my late husband's study, where my son was apparently practicing for an upcoming political appearance. His voice amplified by a forgotten microphone left over from one of his recent campaign events, echoed clearly through the house as he rehearsed what sounded like a major policy speech. The irony of what I heard was so devastating that it felt like a physical assault on everything I believed about truth, justice, and basic human decency. He was practicing a speech about integrity in public service and the sacred trust between elected officials and the citizens they serve, his words ringing with the kind of passionate conviction that had made him such an effective political speaker. He spoke eloquently about the importance of transparency in government, the need to hold public servants to the highest ethical standards, and the duty of leaders to place the public good above personal gain. Every word was not just hollow, but sickeningly ironic, a grotesque perversion of the very principles he was systematically violating through his inherited criminal enterprise. The sound of him practicing these noble sentiments while simultaneously operating a network of corruption, intimidation, and violence ignited a searing, immediate resurgence of every betrayal I had endured, every hope that had been crushed, every assumption about family loyalty that had been proven wrong. This wasn't simply sadness or the gentle disappointment that comes with recognizing someone's moral failings. This was a raw physical ache that seemed to emanate from the deepest parts of my soul, a grief so intense it felt like my heart was being torn from my chest, while I remained conscious to experience every moment of the agony. I was mourning not just the loss of my son to corruption and greed, but the desecration of everything I had once believed about the possibility of honorable public service, the distortion of truth itself for political gain, and the violation of trust that had been the foundation of our entire family structure. The reality of their hypocrisy crashed down on me with an intensity that left me breathless and shaking, trapped in their web of lies while being forced to listen to them practice the very principles they had abandoned in their pursuit of power and wealth. I was living under the chilling weight of understanding how completely they had corrupted everything they touched, turning noble ideals into weapons for their own advancement. Unable to maintain any pretense of composure in the face of such overwhelming moral contradiction, I retreated into the deepest corners of my mind, allowing myself to sink beneath the waves of sorrow that had been building for months but had never been fully acknowledged or released. In the privacy of my internal sanctuary, I finally gave myself permission to feel the complete weight of what had been done, not just to me personally, but to everything I had once believed about the possibility of good triumphing over evil in the world. Tears streamed down my face in an endless flow of grief that encompassed not just my current situation, but the accumulated betrayals of a lifetime, all made infinitely more painful by the knowledge that they were being perpetrated by people who shared my blood and claimed to love me. I wept for my lost innocence, for the integrity I had once believed was possible in public life, for the shattered trust in my own son that would never be repaired. This wasn't a moment of weakness or breakdown, though anyone observing might have interpreted it that way. It was a raw, necessary outpouring of soul-crushing despair that had been suppressed for too long, an acknowledgement that some wounds, especially those involving such profound deception and the corruption of one's own flesh and blood, never fully heal or disappear. The grief wasn't something to be overcome or resolved through time or positive thinking or the simple passage of days. It was a permanent feature of the landscape of my life, now a constant companion that would sometimes retreat into the background, but would never entirely leave me. Some forms of betrayal leave scars so deep they become part of the architecture of the soul, changing not just how we see the world, but how we exist within it. In my overwhelming need for some form of human connection and validation during one of Maria's regular visits to bring my afternoon tea, my carefully maintained defenses finally cracked just enough to allow a few desperate words to escape. The need to be seen and acknowledged as more than just a problem to be managed had become so intense that I could no longer contain it completely. Maria, I whispered, my voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of months of suppressed agony. Sometimes the truth is too heavy to carry alone. Sometimes you know things that would destroy everything if they were spoken aloud, but keeping them inside feels like it's slowly killing you. The words emerged from somewhere beyond my conscious control, fragmented confessions that I hadn't planned to make, but couldn't seem to stop once they began flowing. My eyes pleaded with her for understanding, for some sign that another human being could recognize the authentic suffering that existed beneath the facade of confused decline they had constructed around me. Maria's response was immediate and profound. Her eyes, filled with a depth of understanding that went far beyond her professional training or the normal expectations of her position, met mine without flinching or looking away. There was no judgment in her expression, no dismissal of my words as the confused ramblings of a damaged mind. "I know, Mrs. Eleanor," she said softly, reaching out to gently squeeze my hand with a warmth that carried decades of genuine human compassion. Some truths are like that. They stay with us whether we want them to or not, and sometimes all we can do is carry them as gently as possible. Her carefully chosen words acknowledged both my burden and the impossibility of acting on what I knew, offering the kind of validation I hadn't received in longer than I could remember. In that moment of shared silent vulnerability, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of isolation that had been suffocating me for so long. It wasn't about finding solutions or planning strategies for escape. It was about being seen and believed by another human being who recognized my suffering as real and valid, despite what others might say about my mental state. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt less alone with the weight of what I carried, less isolated in my understanding of the true nature of the evil that surrounded me. Later that week, while watching my son deliver a televised press conference about his latest legislative initiatives, I found myself studying him with the detached fascination of someone trying to understand how evil could present such an attractive face to the world. His charisma, so effective in convincing voters and colleagues of his sincerity and dedication, seemed increasingly brittle and artificial to my educated eye. He had perfected the art of appearing passionate about principles he had completely abandoned, but there was something desperate beneath his performance that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. His smile never quite reached his eyes, which remained as cold and calculating as they had been during our private confrontations. While the world saw his rising political star and celebrated his apparent dedication to public service, I could see the empty core that drove his ruthless ambition, the gnawing hunger for power and control that no amount of success could ever truly satisfy. His success, built entirely on my husband's illicit legacy and maintained through my silent suffering, was ultimately a hollow victory that required constant performance to maintain its credibility. It was a monument to the emptiness that existed, where his conscience should have been a constant reminder of how completely he had sacrificed his humanity in pursuit of power and wealth. The true cost of their depravity was becoming visible in their desperate need for external validation, their constant hunger for more recognition and admiration that could never fill the void they had created within themselves through their systematic destruction of everything that should have mattered most to them. They were thriving on the chilling price of power, but that prosperity was utterly devoid of any genuine satisfaction or peace. During one of my quiet moments of mental composition, when I was carefully reviewing and organizing the vast amount of information I had committed to memory over the months of my captivity, I found my attention drawn to the view outside my bedroom window. There stood a grove of ancient trees that had witnessed decades of seasons and storms, their presence both comforting and instructive in ways that transcended the artificial boundaries of my confinement. These trees were clearly very old, their thick trunks scarred by countless years of weathering every kind of natural assault, their roots running so deep into the earth that no surface disturbance could threaten their fundamental stability. Despite the obvious damage they had endured over the decades, broken limbs that had been struck by lightning bark that bore the marks of ice storms and drought, they continued to reach toward the light with an unwavering determination that spoke of something indestructible in the natural order. Their branches were gnarled and twisted into unusual shapes by the forces they had endured, but this damage had somehow made them more beautiful and distinctive, rather than weakening their essential structure. They stood as living testimonies to the possibility of surviving the worst that nature could offer while maintaining their essential character and dignity intact. As I watched the interplay of light and shadow across their weathered bark, comparing their endurance to my own struggle for survival, it struck me with sudden overwhelming clarity that life in its grand and mysterious design often mirrors exactly this kind of resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. There are unseen forces of corruption constantly at work in every human society, attempting to undermine and destroy the moral foundations that hold civilization together, just as there are cycles of betrayal and disillusionment that seem to repeat themselves throughout history, regardless of how much progress we believe we have made toward justice and truth. Yet there is also an inherent drive within the human spirit to persist, to maintain whatever moral core can be preserved despite every assault upon our values and beliefs. My personal torment, while devastating and all-consuming from my limited perspective, was actually part of this larger pattern of human experience that had been playing out since the beginning of recorded history. The fragility of integrity in a world that often rewards those who abandon their principles for personal gain, the insidious nature of power that corrupts even people who begin with the best intentions, the enduring strength of spirits that refuse to surrender their authentic selves, even when surrounded by lies and manipulation. These were not unique features of my story, but universal themes that connected my suffering to something much larger than my individual circumstances. This realization didn't diminish the reality of my pain or make my losses any less significant, but it placed them in a context that somehow made them more bearable. I was part of an ancient tradition of souls who had faced impossible choices between safety and conscience, who had been forced to choose between speaking truth and protecting those they loved, who had learned to find meaning in endurance when victory was impossible. The trees outside my window were both my teachers and my companions in this struggle, showing me daily that survival with dignity was possible, even under the most hostile conditions, that beauty and strength could emerge from damage rather than being destroyed by it. That evening, sitting alone in my room, while holding my precious coded journal close to my heart, feeling its weight as both burden and comfort, I made a conscious, deliberate choice that would fundamentally transform my relationship with the nightmare I was living. I chose to release the desperate consuming need that had been torturing me for months. The need to fully understand why my own son could fall so deeply into moral darkness, why his wife possessed such calculating avarice, why the world remained willfully blind to their true nature. I had spent countless sleepless nights trying to find rational explanations for their irrational cruelty, searching my memories for some early warning sign that could have prepared me for this level of betrayal, trying to understand how people who had been raised with love and moral guidance could choose to embrace evil so completely that they would threaten and imprison their own family members. But sitting there, in the gentle lamplight, surrounded by the oppressive silence of a house that had become my prison, I finally accepted that some questions about human evil, about the pervasive nature of corruption in positions of power, about the way moral compromises can gradually destroy everything, good in a person's character might simply never have answers that could satisfy my need for understanding. Some darkness in the human soul runs deeper than logic or empathy, can reach some forms of corruption, spread so gradually and completely that they become indistinguishable from normal ambition and success. The why of their transformation was ultimately less important than the how of my own survival, less relevant than my ability to preserve whatever remained of my moral compass and authentic identity. In that moment of surrender, in finally letting go of the need for perfect comprehension of their motivations and complete understanding of how our family had reached this point, a fragile but genuine sense of peace began to settle over me like a warm blanket on a cold night. This wasn't the peace of resolution or justice served, but something deeper and more lasting. The peace that comes from accepting the limits of human understanding and finding meaning not in answers, but in the very act of enduring with dignity intact. This was an act of profound wisdom that had taken me 7 decades and unimaginable suffering to achieve this acceptance that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, not all wounds are meant to heal completely, and that some burdens are simply to be carried with whatever grace and quiet dignity we can muster while clinging to our own truth, however isolated and unacknowledged that truth might be. I found myself discovering a deep, fragile peace that existed not in escape or external resolution of my circumstances, but in the simple, profound act of enduring while holding on to my essential truth, however solitary and unrecognized that truth had become. My life was profoundly imperfect, stripped of the freedom and respect I had once taken for granted, surrounded by lies and threats that made every day feel dangerous and uncertain. But my inner world, my true memories of who I had been, and what I had witnessed, my fundamental moral compass that distinguished right from wrong, regardless of consequences. These remained mine in ways they could never touch or claim. The fear that had once threatened to consume me entirely still lingered like a persistent ache, and the sorrow remained a constant companion that colored every experience with melancholy. But these painful realities no longer dominated my consciousness entirely, or threatened to drive me toward complete despair, as they had in the early days of my awakening to their true nature. I had learned to coexist with fear and sorrow, rather than being consumed by them, to find pockets of peace and meaning within circumstances that seemed designed to destroy both. This imperfect peace, forged in the crucible of my terrifying reality and tempered by months of learning to survive psychological warfare, was a testament to something indestructible in the human spirit. It was proof of our tenacious will to preserve whatever is most essential in our character, even when justice feels unattainable, even when we're forced to live within constant oppressive threats that never fully disappear. The peace I had found was a triumph of inner integrity over outer tyranny, a victory that existed independent of external circumstances or the possibility of future vindication. It was rooted in something deeper than situation or outcome, the recognition that my moral worth didn't depend on their acknowledgement of my truth, that my integrity didn't require their validation to remain real and meaningful. While their physical presence remained as oppressive as ever, their elaborate system of control and intimidation continuing to surround me like an invisible prison, I began to notice that their insidious power over my internal world was starting to diminish in subtle but significant ways. The constant psychological manipulation that had once threatened to drive me completely insane was beginning to lose its ability to make me question the fundamental reality of my own moral perceptions. Their threats, though persistent and delivered with the same calculated precision as always, no longer held the power to make me doubt my sanity or the validity of my understanding of right and wrong. I had learned to recognize their tactics for what they were, weapons designed to confuse and control rather than accurate assessments of my mental state or moral capacity. I was gradually learning to create and maintain an internal sanctuary, a protected space within my consciousness where their manufactured reality could not fully penetrate, where the truth of who I really was could exist safely beyond their reach. This sanctuary wasn't perfect or completely secure, but it was mine, built from the materials of authentic memory and genuine moral conviction that no amount of external manipulation could entirely destroy. Their grip on my sanity, while not completely broken, was definitely loosening with each day that I proved to myself that I could maintain my moral clarity despite their worst efforts to confuse and demoralize me. What had once felt like an iron cage around my thoughts was becoming more like a shadow that followed me but could no longer define the totality of my existence or determine my fundamental sense of right and wrong. This gradual liberation was perhaps the most important victory I could claim, not the dramatic triumph of justice served or freedom restored, but the quiet, persistent triumph of refusing to let evil have the final word in determining who I was or what my life meant. Their influence was becoming a fading shadow in the landscape of my profound, hard-won endurance, a testament to the enduring strength of my spirit, even as my body remained captive, a silent witness to the unending price that power demands from both those who seek it and those who become its victims. One quiet night, as I lay in my bed, with my body heavy from the accumulated stress of months of captivity, but my mind achieving a clarity that sometimes emerged in the deepest hours of solitude, I experienced what I can only describe as a moment of ultimate internal understanding that seemed to emanate from the deepest wisdom I had accumulated through 7 decades of living and these months of unimaginable testing. This profound clarity wasn't about finding answers to the questions that had tormented me for so long. Why such calculated evil had consumed people who should have loved me most. Why they had chosen avarice and power over family bonds. Why the world remained willfully blind to corruption that operated in plain sight among respected public figures. Those questions still existed, but they no longer held the power to drive me toward madness with their unanswered persistence. Instead, this ultimate understanding was about achieving a state of acceptance that transcended my desperate need for solutions, explanations, or external justice. It was a deep, sorrowful peace, born not of resolution, but of finally comprehending something fundamental about the tragic nature of human existence, the deep flaws that exist in our species, and the terrifying ease with which power can corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships. I was finally beginning to grasp that some of life's most painful mysteries exist beyond the reach of rational explanation, that there are forms of human evil so sophisticated and systematic that they defy every attempt to understand their origins or find adequate responses to their destructive force. The why of my suffering was ultimately less important than the how of my endurance, less relevant than my ability to preserve whatever core of truth and integrity remained accessible to me. This wasn't defeat or resignation, but rather the most profound form of wisdom I had ever achieved, a recognition that some battles cannot be won through external action, but only through the internal triumph of refusing to let evil transform us into something as empty and morally bankrupt as our tormentors have become. I consciously embraced the humbling realization that some of life's deepest questions, especially those involving the systematic abuse of power and the betrayal of trust by those we love most, might never have explanations that satisfy our human need for understanding and closure. This acceptance wasn't a surrender to despair or abandonment of hope for meaning in existence, but rather a profound act of wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable suffering and testing. It was a letting go of the illusion that we can control or comprehend every aspect of our experience, a recognition that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not because they lack answers, but because the answers exist in realms beyond our current capacity for understanding. My comprehension of the human condition had deepened through these months of captivity, leading me to acknowledge that corruption and evil exist as fundamental realities in our world. Sometimes the only path to any kind of peace is to accept the presence of evil without feeling compelled to fully comprehend its source or purpose, to find strength not in fighting against what cannot be changed, but in preserving what can be protected. The battle wasn't about defeating them or exposing their crimes to a world that had already chosen to remain blind to obvious signs of corruption. It was about holding on to whatever truth remained within me, however fragmented and embattled that truth had become. This philosophical shift was subtle, but fundamental, changing, not what I experienced, but how I related to that experience. Instead of measuring my worth by what I had been unable to prevent or achieve, I was learning to find meaning in the very act of surviving with my essential humanity intact, of refusing to let their cruelty reduce me to something as morally empty as they had become. The understanding that emerged was that integrity could exist even in the most complete captivity, that moral clarity was ultimately an internal state that no external force could entirely destroy. My body might be imprisoned, my movements controlled, my communications monitored, but something essential within me remained untouchable and free. With a gentle, almost imperceptible sigh that seemed to release something I had been holding too tightly for far too long, I closed my eyes and performed a subtle internal act of letting go that felt like setting down a burden I hadn't realized was still weighing me down. It was like opening my hands and allowing the last of my desperate need for external validation or justice to flow away like water. This was a silent prayer, not for the miraculous intervention that would restore my previous life, or the dramatic revelation that would punish those who had destroyed it, but for the continued strength to live with purpose and dignity while bearing witness to both the beauty and the horror that existed in human nature. I was asking not for freedom from my circumstances, but for the wisdom to find meaning within them. I felt a profound sense of liberation in the very act of learning to live with uncertainty and injustice, recognizing that this agonizing situation was now an integral part of my story, but no longer its complete definition. The question of whether I would ever see my tormentors held accountable, the unresolved nature of our family's crimes, the ongoing prosperity of those who had caused such devastation. These painful realities no longer had the power to define the totality of my existence. I had discovered a form of freedom that I never could have imagined in the early days of recognizing my situation. Not freedom from suffering, which continued to be a daily reality, but freedom within suffering, the ability to experience profound loss and injustice without being completely consumed by them. This was an internal victory of the spirit that no external circumstances could take away from me, a triumph that existed independent of what others might think or do. The story of my life, though, marked by betrayal so profound, it challenged my understanding of what family bonds were supposed to mean, had not succeeded in breaking the essential core of who I was. The people who had set out to silence me as a witness to their crimes had failed in their ultimate objective because they had only been able to touch the external aspects of my existence. They could control my movements, monitor my communications, threaten my friends, and isolate me from the world, but they could not reach the deepest parts of my consciousness, where my authentic self continued to exist. The woman I had spent 70 years becoming remained intact beneath all their lies and manipulations, scarred but not destroyed, wounded but not defeated, instead of destroying me, these experiences had deepened my understanding of human nature in ways that might never have been possible under easier circumstances, transforming me into someone capable of profound wisdom and quiet strength that I might never have discovered without being tested beyond what should be asked of any human being. The trials I had endured had burned away everything superficial and temporary, leaving behind something more essential and lasting than political connections or social status. My imprisonment had become paradoxically a form of liberation, freedom from the illusion that external circumstances determine our worth, freedom from the need for others' validation of our reality, freedom from the desperate pursuit of justice that might never come. I had found peace not in escape, but in acceptance, not in vindication, but in the quiet knowledge that I had endured with my moral compass intact. The profound quiet wisdom I had gained was not something that could be easily shared or explained to others, but it was real and substantial, a foundation upon which I could build whatever remained of my life, regardless of external circumstances. This ultimate acceptance, this hard-won understanding of my place in the larger tapestry of human experience, carried within it a bittersweet but genuine peace that no one could steal from me. I was no longer fighting against my situation, but learning to find meaning within it, no longer seeking escape, but discovering that the truest freedom existed in the sanctuary of my own consciousness, where I could dwell with truth even when surrounded by lies. My home had become my cage, but my mind had become my liberation, and in that internal freedom, I had found something more valuable than anything they could ever steal from me. The price of power that they had chosen to pay would follow them for the rest of their lives, but the price of truth that I had chosen to bear had led me to a form of peace they would never understand or achieve.